Okay, so it's time to start. Today, it is continuation of our webinar from yesterday. So Asia-US cross-border clinical trial and regulatory compliance, strategy and agentic AI framework. So yesterday we focused on in Korea, US, and then Erie, and then Hyung gave a fantastic topics. And today is a continuation today we are going to focus on the India and US. And so the particularly Erie will present again for focus on India, US. And then also we have our expert in Indian clinical trials, Stephen Thompson. So we'll share his experiences like integrating cross-border Indian US clinical trials. Okay, so we have a three speaker including me. Then I share from slideshow first. So today we are going to have a 1 hour session. So I will give you a brief introduction, and then Erie will talk about strategy aspect, and Stephen will take care of the integrating India-US cross-border clinical trials, and then I briefly touch on the ethical framework. And today, because I already gave a talk about the older introduction and editing framework, so I don't want to be redundant because we already recorded, and I'm going to share the recording. So I'm going to have a plan to give more time to speakers to share more detail. So first that I have a talk about let me see. Yesterday I talked about generally that what is multi-regional clinical research trials, and that there is a regulatory harmonization advancing but still fragmented. And then cross-border trial centers global drug medical device development. So we have a two yesterday actually we have a two aspect we need to focus on is one is a traditional drug kind of like the clinical trials and then compliance. And also the other aspect is the medical device is somewhat different characteristics. So we talk about both sides yesterday. And then also yesterday we talked about Korea. So today we are going to focus on India. So India's strong position in global trial compliance. So it's very encouraging that for the Indian side, actually, they modernize SS aligned regulatory framework. So they are globalizing. And also large genetically diverse patient populations because the Indian population shows around, I'm not sure the exact count is, I know there is 1 billion kind. So it's a large genetically diverse patient population is a big advantage. And that FDA acceptance of the high quality Indian data is a norm that under some of the regulatory like a framework, actually it's FDA accept the foreign clinical data, and if there are some confidence, and then the India's has a high quality of data is accepted in the FDA, and expanding India US core development ecosystem is now growing. So this is the main topic actually that Ari and Steve will talk about more detail in deep dive way. So for the agentic AI framework, I'm not going to touch later because I already shared that enough information that I'm working on this space for many different type of the framework I developed to supporting the healthcare and life science ecosystem. So I'm not going to talk about this one. I just defer that you look at my white paper that I share in the chat, and I will share again, and then also share many of you. And also that maybe you can look at my recording. So without any delay, so I pass over to Erie for the strategy side of this topic.
Thank you, Alex. Let me share my slide here. Okay. Okay, thank you everybody for for tuning in. Today we're going to be discussing from a cross-border clinical perspective how you can implement a U.S. Aligned clinical border, cross-border clinical border strategy and regulatory strategy, how they both intermingle and mix together. So specifically, we will be looking at it from an Indian firm perspective or focus. We'll see some of the gaps that we've seen throughout several performers, several sponsors of 510K and de novo devices. And then we'll move into how those clinical trials can be performed in such a way that they're acceptable to U.S. Submissions. But first, a little bit about myself. Just a quick note, my name is Ari. I'm the founder and principal consultant of Apsys Consulting Group. We are a team currently of three principals, one medical doctor out of Switzerland and one former FDA reviewer, and myself, who comes from industry in developing medical devices and clearing them through the FDA specifically. We won't talk so much about pharmaceuticals because that's not our focus in particular. I know Steve will be touching more in terms of on that aspect of things, but a little bit, we've worked with approximately 50 medtech companies. We also serve as a commercialization mentor to some federally funded programs, ARPA-H and the NHLBI Catalyze program. These are programs meant to be accelerator programs similar to DARPA, but in the health sphere. We focus on U.S., Canada, EU strategy, but with a heavy focus on the U.S. strategy in particular. So that's my bio. So what are we going to discuss today? Well, why is it important for Indian firms in AI and medtech to be prepared for U.S. readiness from an early start? A couple of items to consider, or a couple of data points. We know India is a major hub of global research, tens of thousands of registered trials currently. By last count from publicly available sources, 98,000 total CTRI clinical trials. Approximately 200 of those in recent years related to AI. So there's a significant amount of research being done in India, the country of India, by Indian firms, and a lot of advancement, and especially now in the AI and software development programs for medical devices. However, we have noted just a modest stream of Indian origin devices successfully clearing FDA or being approved by FDA. And so we'll talk a little bit about what those obstacles are that have prevented some Indian firms from achieving that goal, and how early strategy can help overcome them. So what will today solve for you? We're going to be answering three basic questions, or three main questions. What are the claims? How do the claims that you make on your US label, how do those translate? What exactly do you want to claim? And how do those translate into, number two, the non-clinical and the clinical evidence package that you need to structure? And how can you have a structured gap analysis and disciplined knowledge management to avoid some expensive rework? Nobody wants to repeat a clinical trial. So what are some good strategies that you can implement when you're executing Indian native clinical trials in such a way that they can be used for FDA submission and they can be accepted by the agency? So in order to answer those three basic questions, we're going to first frame a little bit of context in terms of what does U.S. readiness mean. We'll look at some data-driven insights to gather some information. We'll look at strategy and pitfalls of non-clinical data gaps, and then we'll look at some clinical data gaps that we've seen over and over again working through not just Indian firms but international firms in general. So that's where we're going. First of all, there's two basic components in having a successful clearance with the US FDA. Obviously, your clinical strategy and your evidence package is one component, and then your clinical trial operations is another component. This diagram is meant to demonstrate how the regulatory strategy feeds into the clinical trial operations, which is obvious, but it's also good to make note that at every point in the development of your regulatory strategy for your device, there are decisions that you make in your claims, in your indications, that directly translate into how you will develop your clinical operation on the ground. Selecting the right regulatory path will determine your evidence burden. Designing your non-clinical package and your clinical package, designing your endpoints, all of those will feed into your data collection programs from an operational standpoint when you perform a clinical trial. So we'll be staying on the left side of this diagram for this piece of the talk, and Stephen will be speaking more in terms of the clinical trial operations itself. A little bit of data first to get some context. As we mentioned at the beginning, 98,000 plus total registrations, increasing of interventional and observational trials being performed in India. A huge ecosystem designed to service both the pharmaceutical industry, the biologics industry, and the med device industry. Velocity growth 7.5x in months, from 36 to 271 months. So a huge engine when it comes to developing clinical trials. And that huge engine has resulted in some very successful FDA clearances. Here's a couple of clearances from recent times, and you can note the AI-driven nature of the clearances, the advanced technology that are being used, and it really exemplifies the type of research that's being done and how that's being resulting in US FDA clearances. So this is great. Is there a potential for growth? Absolutely. And what we've noticed is in working with several different Indian firms is that there are some obstacles that prevent clearances that repeat over and over again. So we'll look at those in a little bit more depth and see what we can do to prevent them from being an obstacle to US clearance. But first, a little bit of a strategic landscape or strategic analysis that can be done. Obviously, the more difficult, the more involved your medical claims are, the tougher it will be to develop the evidence package and the more clinical data you will need. This opportunity matrix exemplifies that a bit. So on the X scale, regulatory novelty, you have the less novel you are, the higher probability you have of getting an easier pathway like a 510K. The more novel you are, of course, the more difficult a pathway you'll have to select, de novo or PMA. Similarly, on the activity level on the Y scale, there are zones or areas of research and development that are being heavily funded currently. So there will be some more competition. This slide essentially shows you that there are spaces of high value with relatively low competition if you analyze the clinical trials that are prime for opportunities of growth and development and in US clearances. Also, another aspect to keep in mind is the type of indications that you format around your device will directly impact not only your clinical trial evidence burden, but also your clinical trial type. Retrospective analysis of data is a lot cheaper than a prospective study where you're guiding the diagnosis and clinical treatment of a patient. So making sure that you understand that performance-only 510K approach, it will be a much cheaper, a much smaller evidence burden. and prospective trials that are that involve clinical management of endpoints and of patients will be significantly more costly. So these are all considerations that should factor into your early strategic analysis. So how do you clear a device through the FDA? We'll just briefly talk some basics on UF-FDA strategy, how it compares to Indian regulatory framework. And from that discussion, naturally we'll see some gaps, and naturally we'll see some obstacles that have prevented Indian firms from achieving US clearance previously. First, structurally, as I'm sure many of you understand, the drug, biologics, and device centers at the FDA are different and governed separately. The guidances that each of these centers produce are independent. In many instances, there are some common ones, but are independent, and the expectations can be a bit different. So it's good to understand exactly where you fit in the structure of the FDA, which center will be governing you, and then which office within each center will be governing or regulating your specific device. There are some devices, obviously, as combination devices that are both device and drug, or device and biologic, where you will be governed. You could be governed under either center, but there's a strategic approach to see which center is most beneficial to your device, depending on the mode of action, the mechanism of action. So that's a little bit of a just general foundation. After that, understanding where you will fit within the regulatory framework of the FDA, you need to understand the risk classification of your device. FDA uses a 3-class system: Class 1, Class 2, Class 3. Class 1 being the lowest risk, having the lowest amount of evidence burden. Class 3 being the highest risk, having the highest amount of evidence burden. And Class 3 require a PMA submission, pre-market approval. And Class 1 and Class 2 can have a couple of different pathways, but the most common are 510K and de novo. So depending on where you classify your device, where you end up in the risk matrix, that will determine the need of for clinical data, the extent of clinical data, and the potential cost to managing that clinical expertise. Sometimes the classification of your device will not be dependent on the technology per se, but on the claims or the marketing claims that you make. If you claim certain performance characteristics and certain intended uses or indications or therapies, that could be the difference between a Class 2 and a Class 3, or a Class 1 and a Class 2. So understanding how the variations of product that you can design and where they fit from a classification standpoint, from a pathway standpoint, can really enable you to make the best decision for your business for first launch. As we discussed, 3 major FDA pathways for clearance and approval. 510K hinges on comparing your performance to an already existing performance device that has proven to be safe and effective. Changes in technology or intended use can prevent you from going down this pathway. If your technology or intended use differ from any existing approved device by the FDA, then likely you will be under the de novo pathway, which means of new, where you're essentially creating a new category, device category, that any other competitor that follows you will have to meet the requirements of. And this pathway is, as mentioned, typically for low and moderate risk devices. High risk devices will need to go through a PMA, pre-market approval. And we're talking about implants, life-sustaining devices that are the highest risk classification. So now we understand a bit of general basics of the FDA. How does that compare to the Indian regulatory framework? Well, the mindset is different. The Indian regulatory framework, CDE-CESO, designed around an MDR approach, is completely different to the FDA 510K equivalence approach. So because of that, the level of data that you will be providing and the angle of the documentation you'll be drafting will be completely different. Instead of analyzing checklists and principles, you'll be determining side-by-side comparison, for example, for the 510K route. Instead of standardized test reports, you will be doing other types of reports that are more in depth in some ways, less in depth in others. So it's understanding what the differences are in mindset and approach that will help you early on establish a documentation package and a strategy that would cover both the Indian regulatory framework and the US regulatory framework. So what are some strategic gaps that we've seen from international companies making their first jump or leap into the US? Specifically, Indian companies and other international companies, it's not exclusive to that. Mainly, software documentation, even if your software is 62304 aligned, FDA expectations are in many instances more granular. They want to see specific architecture schemes, specific soup inventories, traceability matrices. Depending on your device may have a very set guideline for the documentation that needs to be reviewed. I can think of, for example, radiological devices that fall in the detection category like CAT-E or the diagnostic category like CAT-X. There are specific guidances that tell you exactly what the FDA wants to see. And these tend to be much more in-depth than other regulatory bodies, such as the MDR approach or the CDE-CSO. Cybersecurity is one that has greatly increased in recent years, and with the new FDA guidance on cybersecurity this year, there are a lot of other devices that previously had not been under the cybersecurity requirements that now fall into the cybersecurity requirements. So you need to understand what those requirements are so that you can build those into your framework early on. And human factors. FDA's recommendation or prerequisite for human factors are pretty specific and delve into the practice of medicine in the US and the standard of care in the US, which may differ from an Indian standard of care or an other European standard of care. So understanding what those differences are and what the FDA expects can help you craft a human factors study that will be approved by the US FDA. So let's look at one specific case study. Bengaluru Oncology Imaging SAMD that had lesion detection. The documentation package was fantastic. It was up to standards. They had been approved by the CDSCO. However, there were some risks that were detected when performing a detailed gap analysis. The documentation on the software structure was incomplete by FDA standards. Cybersecurity was missing. Wireless coexistence was missing, and some of the standards that the testing was performed were different than the standards that the FDA required, the updated standards the FDA recognized. So what happened? Well, this particular gap analysis was conducted later on than necessarily it should have been. So while this firm thought they were ready for U.S. submission, they really needed 6 to 9 additional months just to develop the documentation and perform some of the additional testing that were required that could have easily been rolled into the initial clearance in India. So that's one case study. What are some of the non-clinical domains where we've seen some gaps? Software, we mentioned, cybersecurity, some differences in the biocompatibility and sterility requirements, specifically what is and for how long are you testing? Human factors is a big one, and labeling, of course, is always different, but that tends to be not too difficult. So how do you craft a strategy from the beginning that will set you up for success? The first step you have to take is in detail analyze the claims that you intend to make. What are the claims in the marketing and the marketing that will drive growth from a business perspective, but also not get you in trouble from a regulatory perspective? Here's a couple of examples. The marketing pitch was our AI detects pneumothorax and pleural effusion in X-rays to support triage. So the language here is a little loose. It implies a diagnostic conclusion without being explicit. These are the types of claims that we need to fix to get into the US FDA, because FDA likes to throw around the misclassification or adulteration clause to sponsors after the fact if your marketing changes. So what did we do? Well, we changed the claim into a more regulatory friendly claim. Computer-aided triage notification software to prioritize chest radiographs with suspected pneumothorax and pleural effusion. What was the result? Well, you have a specific clinical endpoint that you'll be looking at. The language is tight, and the evidence burden is lowered from having loose language marketing claim. So this type of analysis is important early on in your development process, so that you set your clinical trials up for success. So we've talked a lot about some of the gaps. What does the FDA look for in outside of US clinical data? Does the fact that the FDA's pickiness force you to only be able to run clinical trials in the US? And the answer is no. You can run clinical trials outside of the US and specifically in India, and that tends to be a very good business decision. But there are some things that you need to keep in mind. First, your good clinical practices, of course. Second, and not so intuitive always, is the population applicability. How does the population that you're testing, how is that represented in the US intended use population? That is one of the key gaps that we often see from international sponsors. And then the practice of care, the practice of medicine, and the standard of care compatibility. We'll skip that one. What are the risks then that we discussed? Population and geography. If you run trials from a single location and only outside of the US, that could be an issue. If your endpoints are not aligned to the standard of care and the practice of medicine of US guidelines, that could be an issue. And your statistics and analysis have to be one that the FDA recognizes and likes to see. Honestly, there are many instances that I've seen that a statistical approach that the sponsor is proposing is valid, but the FDA likes to see a different type of statistical approach. If you don't ask the FDA prior to running your study, you may end up having to run the study twice. That's something nobody wants to do. So how do you make Indian data ready for US trials? Choose your prospective design choices effectively. Make sure your documentation is in line with the US FDA expectations. And if there are bridging studies that need to be done between the Indian population and the US population, that you've aligned with the FDA exactly what those studies will be and how much of your Indian data you can use for your device clearance in the US. Setting yourself up for failure is not going to be good in that aspect. So why readiness now? In conclusion, well, India has a huge opportunity or a huge network of clinical trials and execution of clinical trials. Building US readiness from day one will absolutely benefit you in the long run. Keeping in mind the different mindset from the CDSCO and the US FDA early on can help any gaps that happen from a non-clinical and from a clinical perspective be lessened quicker and get you to market faster. And making sure that your planning and your data collection plans, your strategic approach in running clinical trials is vetted by the FDA prior to you running it will definitely make sure that you have US ready data in your clinical trial. So thank you very much. If you have any questions in particular, if you'd like to see a template gap analysis that we use for non-clinical data and clinical data, we're happy to share with you. Drop a little note in the chat, and I will send that to you independently. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. Okay, so Steven, you share your slide and start. You can take more than 10 minutes, right? Because you can fully explore.
Oh yeah.
Intense experience,
No,
especially. A lot of people are interested in your experience.
Great, awesome. No, I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Steven Thompson, founder of NextTrial AI, and over the next 20 minutes-ish, I'm going to show you why cross-border activation breaks, and more importantly, how to fix it. Ari just walked you through the strategic gaps between the MDR compliance and FDI readiness. And what I'm going to show you is where those same gaps appear operationally and when trials move between India and the United States. So this isn't theory, right? This comes from sitting with the regulatory affairs leads in Mumbai, coordinators in Bangalore, EC chairs in Hyderabad, and CRO ops teams, who burn through the 120-day timelines during trying to get that single site activated. So let's get into it. Quickly, boom. So I am just a little about me. I've built systems at scale at Takeda and Biogen. I built GXP validated data pipelines that cut drug discovery timelines by 30%. At Nubank, I scaled engineering teams from 700 to 10,000 people through an IPO. And at Archer Daniel Midlands, tied a $1.2 billion digital transformation to over 250 million in savings of cost reductions. So I'm not a consultant, I'm an operator. I build things that have to work under regulatory scrutiny at global scale with real money on the line. So we built NextTrial AI to delete that maze. And that's what today is about. So Ari showed you a little bit about, right? Showed you the strategic gap. Indian programs built to the MDR standards. They don't convert to FDA approvals. Non-clinical gaps create months of delays. Those same friction points reappear operationally when you activate trials across those borders. He identified the gaps. I'm going to show you the 42 dependency points where activation breaks and the deterministic AI architecture that fixes it. Boom. So the villain, right? 6 conflicts, FDA, CDSCO, different formats. The IRB versus the ethics committee, different processes. IND versus the CTO4 in India, different requirements. US consent does not equal India annexures, right? Different frameworks. US safety timelines, 24 hours, 14 days, 30 days. Legal deadlines, right? US packet version 2.1 in the United States, India packet 2.0, right? This isn't internationalization. This is the 4 regulatory clocks fighting each other. And when they desynchronize, you lose 30 to 60 to 90 days. And India runs these independent clocks simultaneously. Clock 1 is a preclinical. So GLP data, toxicology, CTO4 prep, right? Number 2 is the ethics and the CTO6. ECs, CDSO submissions, the CTO6 permission. Clock 3 is the safety and compensation. It's a 24-hour, 14-day, 30-day, legally enforced. And clock 4 is the post-marketing, CTRI, MVPI, ongoing compliance. Cross-border trials break because sponsors assume 1 clock and India runs 4 simultaneously. So there are, from protocol to first patient, 42 critical dependency points where 1 error equals 30 to 90-day delay. Where failures appear, where they often appear are the CTO4 doesn't match the tox package, so it's automatically rejected. Annexure inconsistencies are returned. Multi-site EC misalignment, 30-day delay. CTRI errors, automatic rejection. Amendment drifts is a complete desync. So industry average 2.5 query cycles, which is 90 to 120 days. That's industry average. And we compress those with AI orchestration, 30 to 45 days, deterministically. We just held a summit where regulatory leaders, CRO ops, EC members and coordinators, and these are direct quotes, right? EC calendars vary wildly. SEC reviews introduce uncertainty. Foreign sponsors misunderstand the CTO4, right? The documentation, 14 to 20 annexures, all cross-referenced. Multi-site ECs re-review every amendment. So, you know, safety, 24, 14, 30-day sequence, legally enforced in India. US sponsors assume 7 to 15 days. That breaks the trial. The CTRI, treating it as a post-approval admin, and it should be a parallel milestone. And this causes these errors cause rejections. So this is what the operators deal with in the field today. The regulatory steps most sponsors don't see is the clinical activation isn't linear, right? It's preclinical, clinical, safety. So multi-layered and parallel, 4 simultaneous pathways, you know, preclinical, clinical, safety, devices and biologicals, all with interdependencies sponsors don't map until something breaks. So this form of, this is from our regulatory intelligence database, and this is the operational reality behind every timeline. So same protocol, two complete different regulatory universes, right? The US is pre-IND, IND, FDA review, IRB activation. India, it's pre-submission, CT app, SEC review, DCGI approval, 90 days, ECs, CTRI, and then activation. So in the middle is the harmonization challenges, divergent timelines, ethics processes, data requirements. Same protocol does not equal the same activation. And the infrastructure is fundamentally different. So the 5 zones where cross borders break are fragmentation of documentation and version drift, right? Scheduling desyncs, US biweekly versus India monthly maybe. Procedures failures, missing signatures, expired certs, registry errors, CTRI does not equal the CTO4, does not equal the clinicaltrials.gov, right? Zone 5, pathway divergence. Amendments go one direction, not both. Sponsors call this coordination, but it's regulatory engineering. So the real activation flow is US protocol. There we go. US protocol, India localization, EC submission, CTO4 assembly, which is 14 to 20 annexures, query cycles, average 2.5, approvals, sync back to the United States, then activate. This loop breaks. If this loop breaks at any of those 42 steps, right, industry is 90 to 120 days. That equals 850,000 activation costs plus 90 days lost market exclusivity. Next trial, well, the way we're agentically activating is 30 to 45 days, equaling 520K activation cost and 45 to 75 days recovered. So the net impact is 330,000 direct savings plus 40 to 120 million in lifetime value preserved, depending on the indication or the peak revenue. right? The difference, we orchestrate every dependency deterministically, not email and spreadsheets. Every dependency point we orchestrate is money you keep, right? Good. Deterministic, right? Now the foundation of what makes this possible. There's two types of AI, probabilistic and deterministic. Probabilistic is ChatGPT. ChatGPT has a temperature of 0, which is randomness. Different answer every time. Monday, appears compliant. Tuesday, partially compliant. Wednesday, need more information. You cannot use probabilistic AI for regulatory submission. You cannot audit randomness. Nexttrial uses deterministic AI. Temperature 0, same input, same output every time. Always compliant with exceptions. Section 8 requires compensation formula rule 21B. Section 12.5 requires data residency per DPDA Act 2023. Trace ID, right? Same answer every time. Full reasoning trace, immutable ledger. This is the only way to make AI audit ready for regulatory work. And the distinction, again, probabilistic versus deterministic, is in the entire difference between AI that is assists and AI that orchestrates, between tools that suggest and systems that certify. Most AI in clinical trials today is probabilistic. It's helpful. It speeds things up, but it cannot replace human judgment because you cannot audit its reasoning path. So deterministic AI with full reasoning traces, with regulatory grade, that's what FDA and CDSCO can audit, and that's what we built. Again, we'll share out the deck. There's a little bit more content in there as well. And so let me show you the engine. This is Selena. She isn't a single model. She's a multi-layered orchestration system. Selena Foundation model. She's trained on FDA, CDSCO, Anvisa in Brazil, EMA, ICH regulatory corpus. We have LoRa adapters per jurisdiction, India adapter, US adapter, Brazil adapter. A temperature is 0 with full traces logged. We have an agent named Atlas who does workflow intelligence, orchestrates that 42-step dependency graph in real-time monitoring, predictive delay detection, automated milestone tracking. Orion does the data architecture, ingest the protocols, regulations, query patterns, all on AWS Native Health S3 with vector databases, CDICS alignment, multi-jurisdictional data residency, and US buckets and India buckets and Brazil buckets for that data residency. Selena, our AI orchestrator, she's our user-facing layer. She's a natural language interaction using LLM algos. So, there is a place for LLMs, right? They will never go away. The chat GPTs, the Claudes, those algorithms are useful, but in its own purpose. She does document generation, compliance validation. This is what the coordinators interact with. We have an ethics engine, which harmonizes IRB and EC submissions, version controls across jurisdictions, amendment propagation, EC pattern learning. We have a patient prediction engine, eligibility engine, which validates the cohort's availability before the activation. De-identified EHR analysis, screen failure protection, enrollment velocity forecasting, with also trajectory and tolerability and toxicity included as well. So amendment, we have an amendment propagation engine. Protocol changes sync across the regulatory bodies simultaneously. Zero version drift. This is what regulatory grade AI architecture looks like, not a chatbot. An AI orchestration system built for GXP aligned, jurisdictionally aware, execution. Every agent has a specific role and is governed. Every output is deterministic, and every reasoning path is auditable. Let me show you this is not a framework. This is our 10-step. I got a cool graphic there. So this is our 10-step, each deterministic, each law-backed, each infallible. We have protocol harmonization. This is this is the framework. The preclinical completeness, which validates. I'll scroll down a little bit. Boom. We also have agent names for India and Brazilian names for the Brazilian agents. Scroll down a little bit. So here's the context there. The preclinical completeness validates talks against CDSCO, cross-references against the FDA IND, flags gaps before the CTO4 submission. The annexure auto build generates 14 to 20 CTO4 annexures, validates cross-references, enforce version control. We have an ethics sync, which submits the US IRB, India EC simultaneously, tracks calendars, harmonizes consents per institution, CTO4 dependency validators, CTO6 auto validation, pre-validate before SUGAM portal, predict query likeliness, generate preemptive responses, and then CTRI metadata normalization. There we go. Ensuring that the CTO4 equals the EC docs, right? Which then equals the CTRI registry. Auto-populate 90% of the fields. Safety clock automation. Configure that 24-hour, 14-day, 30-day timelines and integrate the PV systems and alert on deadlines. So 0 rejection checks, final scan. Scores must be greater than 94. If less than 94, auto remediate and revalidate. So activation package sync, we lock those versions with a cryptographic hash. US equals India equals identical. So look at the AI enforcement layer at the bottom. So 8 different agents, right? These are the Indian ones. Shastra, Kavach, Drishti, Knock, compliance, right? Timeline, readiness, all working simultaneously, deterministic, explainable, and traceable. 0 rejection isn't by chance because it's engineered. This is the difference between digitizing a broken process and deleting the maze entirely. Let me jump down to the India readiness score. So we have, let's make this tangible, right? Live India readiness score for phase 2 oncology trial. Overall 87 out of 100, target greater than 87. This site is ready. So the CTO4 compliance, 94, all annexures present. Ethics readiness, 92. Mumbai, the Tata Memorial meeting, December 15th, 88% approval probability. Bangalore meeting, December 20th, 92% probability. Recommendation, submit Mumbai 2 days earlier. So competing trials risk, 75, right? So 3 active oncology trials at sites. Impact is minus 15%. Enrollment velocity. So recommend add Hyderabad, low competition and high volume. Site infrastructure is 88%. We validate all the imaging has been validated. Lab, NLBL, accredited, pharmacy, GMP compliant. Minor gap, the EDC integration is still needed. Predictive timeline, Mumbai 24 weeks, Bangalore 26, Hyderabad week 28 if added. Right, this is quantified feasibility, not subjective. Predictive intelligence backed by data. And you know exactly where you stand, what gaps exist, and what timeline to expect before you submit a single document. Let me share with you now the certification. This is a 5-step process where we do pre-validation, which is complete the CTO4 analysis, automated scan of the C23 NDCTR requirements, cross-reference validations, annexure completeness. We do the scoring next by week 14, CDSCO score, component scores, scientific merit, safety, ethics, data management, compensation, and query probability perception. We run down to stage 3, which is remediation, if needed. Score is less than 94, auto-generate fixes and extract with exact language, and track the implementation and rescan. So we do then a 15, week number 4, which is the certification. So zero rejection certified, cryptographic signature, trace, reasoning trace in our ledger, cleared for the SOGRAM portal. And then 5, post submission, real-time SOGRAM tracking, pre-drafted query response is ready. Resolution is 3 to 5 days versus industry 15 to 30, 15 to 25. So guarantee the CTO4 rejection due to doc error after certification, full refund plus free remediation until approval. We stand behind this because the system works. We've certified 12 pilots, 0 rejection after certification, and that's not luck. That's deterministic orchestration with 23-point validation against NDCTR Rule 7, cross-referenced against every requirement, validated against every historical query pattern in our database. Let me show you about the version. What most sponsors lose 2 to 3 months. 2 to 3 months, which is the version drift. So before next trial, right, the US IRB protocol version 2.5 was approved on March 15th. India EC protocol 2.0, March 8th was approved. CTO4 protocol 2.2, March 20th. CDSCO query. The result is a 30-day delay for reconciliation. So by doing the packet sync and locking a version, the US version 2.1 has a hash, EC 2.1 has a hash, CTO4 version 2.1 has a hash. 0 discrepancies, 0 queries, 0 delays. How that works is we version lock, protocol is frozen with a cryptographic hash, simultaneous distribution, the same versions to all bodies, all sections are numbered and validated, and then the amendment propagation. So triggering changes, synchronized updates, right? Audit trail, complete lineage in our S3. Look at the visual before the end X's. So chaos, conflicting versions, delays, after is all green check marks, locked cryptographic hashes, synchronized distribution. This is where the sponsors lose months. We prevent it architecturally. So hard numbers from real pilots. So proof, 12 pilot trials, 8 oncology, 3 immunology, 1 cardiology between 2024 and 2025, 50 to 66% activation timeline reduction, from 90 to 120 days to 30 to 45, 94% first submission approval, right? Industry standard is 70 to 75. That's plus 24 points. 67% query cycle reduction. So again, industry standard 2.5 cycles, 15 to 25 days. Our cycle 5 to 7 days. That's 67% fewer and 76% faster. 0 version drift. That's 0. Industry standards 35 to 40% version drift. Coordinator time savings, right? 12 to 15 hours per week that could be spent better with the patients. So that's reduced down to 4 to 6 hours per week. Cross-border sync improvements, US gap, US India gap is 24 to 28 weeks down to about 2 weeks. So 39% cost reduction, that's 850K down to 520K per activation. These aren't projections, these are outcomes from real trials with real regulators in real time. We have 5 minutes. I got a quick case study here, and then we'll wrap up. Boom. So here's a case study. We have a mid-sized biotech, Series C, advanced NSCLC phase 2, which is 3 US sites, 2 India sites, 120 patients. The challenge was 24 to 28 week US to India gap projected. Feasibility data was 8 months old. The cohort was 40% overestimated. The CTO4 had missing docs, and the EC query on compensation was a 3-week delay, which impacted the CTRI, which was also delayed. So the next trial solution was with physics-informed patient predictive eligibility engine, found cohort 35% smaller, added Hyderabad proactively. So week 4, parallel submissions, IND plus CTO4, same week, not sequential. Week 8 to 12 was ethics orchestration. Mumbai was a 6-page consent, Tata EC style. Bangalore was a 5-page, Munipal style. So week 12 to 16 was a CTO4 score of 94, 2 queries, both resolved in 48 hours. And week 26, first patient in, both the United States and India simultaneously. The outcome, 45-day India activation versus 120 projected, 0 rejections, 2 times enrollment, velocity, $1.8 million value created, 330K savings plus the 1.5 accelerated revenue. That's 30 times the ROI. And that's deterministic orchestration. That's what happens when you delete the maze instead of digitizing it. So I did leave. We got 3 minutes, so perfect timing. Any questions? I've got a little bit of a slide here. Problem, architecture, proof. Let's open it up.
Thank you, Steven. Yeah, so we can share the presentation and recording so we can have enough time to interact with other people that I already mentioned that I have around 2,000 in my network direct email to them. So we have more time to interact them, have a question and then comment, everything. But anyway, because it's fantastic, right? Because we actually tried the cross-border India-US trial, right? And then actually that we had Steve actually I'm gonna take about to the next trial, and then we work a lot of the different thing, and then we already other than already built up actually we have a fantastic innovation idea that already as I'm patent attorney and the advisor to next trial we already filed a patent beyond this one and the full agentic AI framework to support this ecosystem. And yesterday, actually, we also talk about how about like a triangle kind of consortium, kind of like India, South Korea, United States, cross-border, clinical trial, and compliance. And then my view is that I have several occasions to have a webinar that I'm thinking about like clinical trial and then the regulatory compliance is one process rather than 2 separate processes. They are tied, integrate. So it'll be like in the future that I mentioned, like for example, that there is a convergence in the pharma and the medical device area, right? And I'm thinking, yesterday I talked about like recently there are big giant like consumer electronics, Samsung Electronics and Google and other companies actually that interested in healthcare and life science area. So in some time, actually, there is all full convergence, right? And then truly there is a unified scheme in clinical trial and then the compliance. And also like that in that setting that actually our trial today will be the one of the very, very important step, right? And then in addition to like really like expertise, we can collaborate. And then as I mentioned that our agentic AI framework is actually augmenting the expert, right? Because not replacing. And then you see that actually the Stephen already done in the proof that it's fantastic, right? 'Cause it saved a lot of money, cost, right? Complexity, right? So I hopefully that in the future we'll have a more better topic, and then we will say like show the more like the kind of like the actual, to see that actually like a triangle tie, like a cross-border India, South Korea, and the US, right? And I hope to do that. So thank you for attending today's webinar. And then as I told you that we'll share the recording and then presentation later. So I hope to see you in my next webinar. Also like Stephen and me and Eric will keep collaborate. So we have any fantastic news, I will share with you. Okay. Thank you. Take care. Bye bye. Thank you. See you.
Thanks, everybody. Happy
Thank
holidays. Merry
you.
Christmas.
Happy holidays. Yes.
Well.
Nice
Yeah.
job, Steve.